Here's my technique for painting waves in watercolor via a little acronym I've come up with called CLOVES. That's the name of the acronym. And CLOVES stands for, and this is the best I can manage, C for color, L for layers, O for observation, V for values, E for edges, and S for shape or shapes. So the subject of the scene is Dartmouth in the UK, a very pretty coastal town, split by the River Dart. Well, there's Kingswear. We're looking at Kingswear. The behind us is Dartmouth. Over to the right is the English Channel, and the River Dart flows down from the left. And what attracted me to the scene? Well, the light coming in from the right, the chance to paint these waves as well, trying to give an impression of these lovely waves and the light hitting parts of those waves as well. So I hope you like it. My name is Tim Wilmot, watercolor painter and demonstrator, tutor as well. And I'm going to cover the complete painting processes in this video, covering my acronym CLOVES for this technique for painting waves. So first of all, looking at the scene. So color, first of all, looking at the color of the sea. And I notice lots of cools, warms as well. So if I just zoom in a bit more. So look at that cool blue there. What would you call that blue? And then coming down closer to us, we've got warmer colors creeping in, getting a little bit larger as they come towards us. L for layouts. Well, in watercolor, we have transparent layers. So I want to try and lay down these different layers with different brushes. These different layers, one on top of the other, increasing in density, trying to get that luminosity, that kind of the texture of the water. O is for observation. So before I start painting, before I start drawing, I observe the scene. Pretty easy with a photograph, but if we were there live and the sea is moving, well, we're going to have to spend a bit of time just watching and observing the water and trying to, if we were painting there live, trying to have a little bit of a photographic memory, trying to capture that moment in time and what those waves look like. But as we're painting from a photograph here, I'm painting from a photo, a little bit easier. But spend time to observe and plan the approach with this water. V is for values. Well, if we look at these blues, for example, well, there's lighter blue in the distance, maybe a little bit darker coming towards us, but some of the blues get a little bit darker. Similar blue, but a little bit more intense, a little bit darker. Can I zoom in a bit more? So a little bit light there. There's a darker blue there. Darker blue, darker blue, darker blue. So thinking about values. Next, edges. There's a mixture here of hard and soft edges. So for example, hard edge here, that darker, that warm, dark reflection there. Some of the reflections of the boat, hard edges. Softer edges, maybe some of the transitions from the warm to the cool. Let's zoom in again. A soft edge there, cooler there, warmer there. Bit of a soft transition from one to the other. And very importantly, the shape of these waves, the shape of the bigger waves and then the shape of the reflections. So a little bit easier in the foreground, for example. Let me just go down to this foreground area here. So we have this large wave, crest of the wave there, light hitting the right hand side. There's another wave here, a crest of a wave there, another one there. But then we've got the shape of the reflections, and thinking about the brush we would use to replicate that shape. Let me find a pretty obvious one, like that one there, for example. Look at that shape. It sort of goes down and then up, and then down again, and then up, and then the bottom edge of that shape goes down, up. It's almost like a moustache. But we got these shapes. They're sort of elliptical, curved shapes of the reflections. And then the background, Kingswear, those lovely houses. I'd love to live there. I'd be painting non-stop all day if I lived over there, looking out the window, all the different weather conditions coming at you. The south is I think generally the south is to the right, or the southeast maybe to the right. Yeah, I think I'm right. But a lovely group of houses on the distant headland, and then over to the right, with the sort of misty conditions coming in from the sea. We've got a headland there, a little bit lighter, and then beyond that, another headland, lighter still. The sky is not bad as well, quite atmospheric, bit of light there, dark clouds as well, dark clouds giving us a bit of contrast with the lighter fronts of these houses facing out to sea. Yeah, so a good range of values to contend with in the background. So that's the plan. Dartmouth, and a technique for painting these particular types of waves here in Dartmouth, Devon, UK. On to the drawing. Paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford. This is 300 grams, 140 pounds. It's 15 inches by 11 inches. And I've got it securely taped with some masking tape there. I'll cover my palette as I go through the painting, but nothing's changed, or nothing changes really with my palette. An important first step then to get the overall composition right, thinking about the horizon first of all, and then that lonely boat. I think that boat's a little bit too lonely, so I'm going to put a figure in there and a little bit of interest, the figure rowing the boat over to the far side. So that's the plan, keeping the background fairly simple as well. I'm going to be using a 3B pencil for doing the outline drawing, starting with the top of the hill on the left-hand side, top left corner, and work my way down just to get in the basic edge of that distant headland, Kingswear, and then thinking about the horizon and the water's edge. I'm not actually drawing a continuous line for the edges of these shapes. The distant shoreline is not perfectly straight. It's got a little bit of a tiny bit of a soft edge to it, but there's movement in the water that's not giving us a very straight edge to the distant waterline. The position of the boat is very important. I don't want it right in the middle. I think if I've got this rowing boat rowing over to the right-hand side, then have it slightly left of the center line. So we've got this kind of motion, the thought of this boat going over to the right-hand side, the expanse of the sea over onto the right-hand side. Also, I need to think about a little bit of perspective here and the viewing angle. Want to make sure that the boat looks fairly accurate as regards the lie of the sea. I don't want to be looking. Don't want to give the impression of looking down on the boat, or we're too low in the water. So the photograph I had, the source photo, is a guideline. I've tilted the boat a little bit, and I'm just sort of making up a figure here, a rowing figure, keeping it fairly simple. It's far enough away that I don't need to be too detailed with this figure, and fairly dark in value. And I think the most important thing is trying to get a feeling of the movement of this figure rowing this boat, and the line or the angle of the oars as well, left and right. So just a simple line for that, making sure the edges of the boat look correct, just strengthen up a little bit. Get the bow right, get the stern right. And with this boat, the far edge is fairly straight. The nearer side has more of the curve in it. I've just done a bit of cross hatching of the face just to serve as a memory to me of where this figure is going, which direction it's pointing. And that's really it for the drawing, nice and simple. And then straight on to laying down some paint, starting with the sky. Now the colours I've got here, these colours are mainly from Jackman's Art Materials. The source, the link to their site is in the description of this video. I've got neutral tint at the top, then burnt umber, burnt sienna, third one down, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, cobalt blue in the middle, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, cadmium red, light red, cadmium orange, cadmium yellow, and then along the bottom I've got lavender and quinacridone gold. So on the left hand side, as per the photo, I've kept it nice and blue, nice bright sky over that side, but then more of a sort of ominous cloud coming in from the sea, going a little bit darker here. Brush I'm using is a soft aqua brush from Raphael, which is a synthetic mop brush. It's got very good water retaining capabilities, good edge to it as well, good point when they're new. Mine has actually lost its point a long time ago. So go quite dark there without those clouds, mixture of warms and cools. Pick up a little bit of that quinacridone gold, give a bit of a golden tinge to that right hand side, and then a lot lighter down towards the top of the hill into the distance. If I've gone a bit too dark, I can lift off at this stage. Everything is quite damp. Pick up a little bit of cerulean blue now, starting with the sea. I'll colour in the headland in a minute, just while the top sky and clouds are drying. But on to painting the sea. The size of this brush, this is a size 4 of the Raphael soft aqua, and just loosely following that water line in the distance, going a little bit lighter over to the right hand side. This drill will dry lighter, of course, with watercolor. Things generally dry a lot lighter than when you apply them. Now, just about there's a light patch. There's a bit of brightness hitting the water surface. So I want to just leave that a little bit unpainted. Coming down to the boat, painting negatively around the boat, because some of that boat will be quite light in colour. There's a little bit of a slope on the board of about 10 degrees, so gravity is helping me a little bit. Halfway down the boat, and my brush marks now they are getting a little bit larger. So whereas in the distance I was using fairly narrow brush marks, I'm going a little bit thicker with these brush marks, alternating the values as I come down. The paint is also granulating just a little bit as well to help me. I've left a light patch just below the boat in the middle. That will be another bit of reflected light bouncing off the side of the boat, and also in that bottom right corner there's a little bit of light down there hitting the right hand side of the waves. So there we are, bigger brush marks now, bigger, bolder brush marks down in that, down towards the foreground. And applying different ratios of paint to water, I'm getting those subtle variations in values already. I will strengthen that up as I apply these different layers on top of this, but that's my, if you like, that's my first layer. Now I've allowed that initial layer to dry, and now with a smaller synthetic brush, applying different wave shapes, starting in the distance, coming towards the foreground. Very thin little waves in the distance, quite light in value as well, but just a little bit darker than the first layer. This synthetic brush has got a good shape to it. It's got a nice point and edge to it that will help me just create that edge. Also, what will be important as I create these waves is the angle I hold the brush as well. I've got a slight angle of the brush, but mainly 90 degrees to the surface, and that's allowing the paint to flow out quite easily. As I go over to the right, just a little bit lighter over to the right hand side. Fairly random, leave some lighter patches just where there might be some wind ruffling the surface, or there's a little bit of light, a gap in the clouds, a little bit of light creeping in there. A little bit of lavender there. Lavender is quite a nice opaque colour, so it's going to, thinking about transparency, it's going to be a little bit thicker on top of that initial layer. The more I look at the water, I just see so many different colours, different types of blues, golden browns, light browns, dark browns. We've got the dark reflection of the boat as well. Now I want to warm things up a little bit, so I'm going to go in with the quinacridone gold. Probably the most difficult word to pronounce in watercolour. Hopefully I got it right, but a nice warm glow. What would be another alternative? Could have used maybe a little bit of burnt sienna and yellow ochre. That might be a good one. Perhaps a touch of orange just to make it a little bit more vibrant. Closer then, coming closer, make these reflections, these waves just a little bit thicker, but also thinking about the shape of these wave marks as well. There, just if I hold the brush at a 45-degree angle, I can get more of an elliptical shape to those wave marks. Also, go back into the area that I've painted already, just while the paint is still a little bit damp. I can go in there and just drop in a little bit of thicker colour. We're trying to add in lots of different shades, lots of variations of colour and values and edges and shapes. So always going back up to that top area where it's still a little bit damp. Gone a bit darker now. Go cooler again. There's a slight sort of warm brownish band just beyond the boat, and then there's the boat itself. Keep that cool round there, and then a little bit warmer down towards the foreground. In fact, it's looking at the photo, it's a lot warmer coming down towards the foreground. There's going to be a lot of fiddly little brush marks with this particular technique. Another alternative might be with a bigger brush, just to, well, stick with that first layer that I did, and then while that surface is still damp, you can go in with a softer brush, but produce some elliptical shapes, with soft edges, with a darker colour, thicker paint, more paint to, or less water to paint ratio. Bit more warmth then in that band beyond the boat, and then applying a bit of coolness there, bit of more of a watery mix, getting in softer edges. Little gaps are emerging as well, which could be lighter bits of lighter areas of the sea catching a little bit of light. We're trying to get a bit of movement in this water, the fluidity of the water, trying to capture the essence of water. And it takes a bit of practice. I am by no means an expert. I'm just learning as I go along the way, and I'm just really, as I say, I was observing the scene. I'm just trying to think, well, with watercolor, how would I capture the feeling of that water, the waves, the light, the colors, those different the different values I see as well. It's a little bit of trial and error. So a darker blue here, coming up to the edge of the boat, and then continue on the other side. I'm going thicker with these brush marks, these shapes now. The brush head is almost flat. I've lost that edge, holding it at a 45-degree angle. Get that almost, I'm stabbing the surface and then just quickly lifting off to get that elliptical wave or reflection mark. So warm, cool, just alternating that as I come down over the scene. as the brush runs out of paint, it goes a little bit lighter. Start off dark, and then as I go over an area, it becomes a little bit lighter, which is a good thing. Get that variation of values. I need to be a little bit careful around that area. I want to keep that nice and light. And I'm looking at the photo. There might be just a few little thin slithers of darkness going across that lighter area, and then continue again over to the right. Almost little flicking techniques with the brush. Pick up a bit of water just to make it a little bit weaker, and then back into some warmer stuff. I suppose the actual direction you do these marks, I'm right-handed, so it's easier for me to make these little reflection shapes, starting from the left, going over to the right. If you were left-handed, you could do it the other way. There's no issue with that. But you're going to have to, because the light's coming from the right, I guess you'd have to go lighter on the right hand side, and then go, as you go over to the left, you're going from right to left, you're going a little bit darker. Also the angle of these shapes as well, they're a little bit more pronounced. So in the distance, more horizontal, and the thickness, they're a lot thinner. But as I'm coming down to the foreground, I can tilt them a little bit more. I've got a bit of a stronger angle on some of these reflections. This is one of those paintings where it's going to look, to be honest with you, a complete mess at the moment, but hopefully we'll be able to pull things back as I apply a few more layers and darker values, and get in a few nicer edges, soften up a little bit of the edges as well, where there might be just a little bit too hard. This is a different brush. This is this one is a Princeton Aqua Elite, and produces a very nice brush mark. I use it actually a lot for foliage. I think it's brilliant for doing trees and different foliage marks. But here in this example, creating these little elliptical marks here can be quite useful. But just as I was doing with the smaller brush, make those marks a bit thicker in size in the foreground, and then a little bit thinner, more horizontal as I go into the distance. And the mess continues. Tiny bit darker on the left hand side, and at the top there, it's got an incredibly good point, this Princeton, so I can, the other good brush I've got that produces a good point is the Levinson Rigger brush. That's also, that would be very good actually in the distance to create some very thin little lines. Use the fingertips as well, just to lift off a bit of the paint where it was just a bit too much. As they the paint surface is drying, I am getting some harder edges as well. So we're just starting to get in some harder edges, but down there in the bottom left corner, that warmer colour was still quite damp, so get that little bit of a blending, little bit of a merging going on. Soft edge. More of a watery mix now, just softening things up, going over areas that I've done already. I can see one potential danger with this technique of applying these layers and brush marks on top of brush marks on top of brush marks, is that it could appear a little bit overworked. And to try and avoid that, I've just got to be conscious of stopping now and again and just reflecting on what I've done so far. But also I'm thinking, when I go in with some darker, if I soften things up a bit, going with a darker colour, that's going to maybe reduce the sense of a little bit of overworking. Because that's the last thing you want in watercolour, is a sort of messy, overworked area where we've applied too many layers, or it just looks like a muddy mess. But just going through this gradually, the right ratio of water to pigment, good quality paints, good quality paper, and just checking on your progress now and again, just making sure, don't rush things too much, and fingers crossed it won't be too overworked. Coming in from the right hand side, some lighter reflections. I don't want to ruin or go over too much those lighter areas that I've got there on that right hand side. And then from the crest of the wave, we've got some darker reflections coming down the left-hand side of the wave. So dark at the top, but then going a little bit lighter towards the trough, the bottom of that wave, that little sort of depression. That's the other thing I'm noticing. It's almost like looking at a mountain range with lots of little peaks and troughs, and the light, thinking about the soft nature of the water surface, and these at the crest of the wave, it's quite dark, creates a nice bit of contrast with the light on the right hand side of that wave. Yeah, try and think of, it's a fluid surface, it's a fluid material, but obviously, but try to think of it as a solid material. And certainly, looking at a photograph, that does make it a lot easier. So far, so good then. Now, next, I want to use a softer brush and apply some very soft horizontal bands of, well, in this case, warmer colour. Just going to glaze over the top. I'm just applying a very thin layer of, in this case, that quinacridone gold. Not over the whole of that back area, just a few little bands where, again, I'm looking at the photograph for inspiration, and I can see there's just a little bit of warmth, a bit more warmth coming into that distant area there. And this is going to help just push things back a little bit with that softness, softening up the edges and just giving a bit of a warmer glow to that area. Now I've used there a squirrel mop brush, which is a very soft brush. This one, the one I'm using, is from Winsor & Newton. It's a medium-sized mop brush, so nice and soft. I will constantly go back into sea, but now I'm just doing the distant headland and work my way in that on the far shore, work my way over this. But first of all, start with that distant headland, just a little bit darker than the sky above it, a little bit dark at the top of the hill, but nice and soft, nice and light coming down towards the water's edge. And I lifted off a little bit of that bottom of that hill just before it meets the sea to create the feeling of a bit of sea mist coming in from the ocean over to the right, coming in from the English Channel. While that's drying, I need to let that dry a little bit so I get in a harder edge of the next headland coming towards us. But I will be going back to the water again with my Princeton Aqua Elite, just adding in a few more wave marks. If I want to speed up the process, grab my hairdryer just to speed up that process. And then the next headland coming towards us will be darker, but it will give us, or gives me the opportunity of painting up to the edges, the front edges of the houses that are catching the light. So I'm going to get a bit of contrast in there. I'm taking practically every colour of the palette here. Lavender, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna for this next bit of headland coming towards us. Darker, thicker. Still a little bit of a golden glow to the top. I don't want to go too warm with the colour because, of course, I'm trying to push things back a little bit. And then using this Princeton brush, it's actually quite a soft brush. And I could have used any sort of medium-sized synthetic round for this, or indeed that mop brush that I had just a few minutes ago. That would have worked equally well. Just to, I mean, the most important thing here is the values, but trying to get in a sense of the trees here and the actual edge of the ridge of this headland, trying to create the impression of some trees just sort of popping up above the edge, a bit more sort of silhouetted against the sky, and then come down a little bit darker, perhaps a bit cooler as well. Lift off with a finger on that right hand edge. It's a little bit lighter there, where again we've got the effect of the sea mist coming in. Now down to the water's edge. Yes, it's a straight edge, but not too straight. I want to give the impression of a little bit of distant water movement, perhaps some waves lashing against the shore. I can leave just a few little sparkles of paper showing through that could be something catching the light over there. Quite a simple water's edge, just extending out a little bit to the right in the distance. And while it's still damp, I can go in with some darker, thicker colour just to add in a little bit of darker value there. It could be darker trees or a bit of shadow between trees. Also, while that headland's quite damp, I can just drop in a little bit of water as another technique to just give the impression of some trees over there. So going in with darker colour, a little bit of tiny bit of splattering as well while it's still quite damp, gives the just different textures over there. Main headland then, main headland that's facing us, which is Kingswear, and I didn't draw in the shapes of the houses, so I'm trying to really guess where they're going to be as I come down. So I'll be doing a little bit of negative painting around the shapes of these houses. And they're just really lots of geometric shapes and fairly, I guess the tops of the shapes are going to be fairly flat, but then as the houses sink into the headland, we've got trees and foliage covering the bottoms, so they're a bit more curved and less straight, the bottom of these houses, unless there's other houses in front of them as we come down to the shoreline. Hard edge against that cloud, few rooftops. It is a very complex, complicated, distant headland with all these houses, but I've got to simplify it. The main attraction is the water and the rowing boat and the figure, so don't want to put too much detail into these buildings, but just capture the feeling of distant buildings, and then over on the right hand side the light hitting the fronts of the houses, the light coming in from the right hand side. I'm painting around the house shapes, so where they're grouped together, thinking about the shape of those houses, and then later on I'll just go in with a lighter value just to create the, because a lot of these houses are in the shade, but they're lightly painted. A lot of them are white or a very light colour, so they're quite a lot lighter than the darker trees around them. Down to the shoreline, there's a few more apex and triangular shapes appearing with the tops of rooftops. Particularly in the middle, there's a few rectangular shapes there. Yellow ochre, cobalt blue, pick up a bit of water as well, just start to apply a little bit of darker value to some of these houses. So I need a brush with a good edge. This one's a Jackman's art brush, synthetic, number 12. So a bit more water here. Doesn't really matter what colour, but the value is important to give the impression of a lightly painted house in the shade with low light, and then getting that soft transition from that lighter, from the lighter colour of the building to the darker foliage and trees around it. And with a slightly a slightly harder brush, I can then just lift off a little bit around the edges of these houses just to create a bit more of a soft edge down to the waterfront, leaving little bits of paper showing through that could be light hitting the top of a roof or a chimney pot or a window maybe. So we've got the lighter houses, and then just before the water's edge it does go a little bit darker, where we've got there's obviously the harbour wall and some sort of the retaining wall on that far side there as the foundation, the protection of these houses on the water's edge. And I do want to also make the water's edge a soft transition to the sea. Continue over. It's important to have a brush with a good point here. Over to the end. Use the fingertips just to lift off little bits here and there. Give some sort of randomness to that dark line. Continue on with the houses, the buildings above it. I'm doing all this fairly quickly. I want to keep it nice and loose. The more I think about those distant houses, the tighter I'm going to get, and there'll be more detail creeping in. I deliberately didn't draw those houses in. I could have actually drawn in a few shapes just to create the outer edge of some of those groups of buildings, possibly, but I think it's going to look all right. I'm just going in fairly loosely here. So yeah, apart from obviously some details now of darker rooftops and just a few windows and some horizontal lines and vertical lines, that's that headland done. Very important stage now is this boat, and thinking about the direction of the light. So the light coming from the right, I want the left hand inside the boat nice and light on the left hand side, darker, very dark at the stern, so I can mix in something really dark here for the figure, the arms, the right arm of the figure, shoulder. Drawn in or painted the face. Smaller brush. This is a synthetic round brush. This is a size 4 brush now. Most important thing is getting the sense of these two arms grabbing the oars and the energy of rowing across this patch of water that may not be ideal rowing conditions. A little bit of a swell Now the side of the boat with the sun hitting it, darker at the back, a little bit darker at the front, then that soft patch in the middle. It's catching the light, so pick up a bit of clear water and just paint in that middle area there that's catching the light. Lift off with the finger if it's gone a little bit too dark. Slightly darker at the water's edge. And the back of the boat, doesn't really matter what colour. I think the boat's green, so I've mixed in a little bit of viridian green just to, as a nod to the colour of the boat, but it's dark at the back there. A little bit of a curve on the top, and then come down to the water's edge. Be a bit careful coming over to the right hand side. That paint's still wet. I don't want too much of a soft edge there. And then reflections. Observe the photo just to check the shape of these reflections. This is quite an important reflection to get right. And it's emphasizing the movement of the water and the size of the swell, and it's the actual reflection is quite dense towards the boat, but then becomes a little bit, but there's a few more gaps in these darker marks as we come to the foreground. A little bit of a dark reflection at the front of the boat. Just painting around that lighter area there. I want to try and preserve that. I will use a bit of white paint just to add some extra sparkle to the water surface as a very last stage, but I want to try and keep the freshness of the paper there. Now back to the water and adding in some darker, a lot darker marks now. Another layer, darker in value. Doesn't really matter too much what the colour is. You can't really see what the colour is of these darker marks. It's generally a darker brown, I guess it would be. I'm going to emphasize it. I'm going a little bit darker than the photograph just to create a little bit more of an impact. So there's that quinacridone gold again, bit of neutral tint. So a really dark, warm color. Could have used neutral tint and burnt sienna. That'd be another obvious choice. Connect with the boat a little bit as well with some of these darker marks. Again, they're going to get thicker, a little bit more erratic as I come down to the foreground. A little bit darker at the top of the ridge of these waves, and then a little bit softer. So I'm flicking the brush and getting a few little dry brush marks here as well, which is helping to give a slightly different soft edge. We're working with very dry paint here, whereas my softer edges before was applying paint, thinner paint to a damp surface, so getting a soft edge, the warms against the cools. But now this is fairly thick. There's very little water on this brush, and I just want to add in a few of these marks, getting in that elliptical shape. The angle of the brush as I hit the paper is very important. And might be a little bit too dark here, but we'll see what it looks like when it dries. If it's gone a bit dark, I could always add a little bit of water to it. But I want to go, this layer is quite important. I think this adds, as I say, it adds a lot more impact to the water. It was a bit sort of weak and wishy-washy before. This is going to give more of a sense of the, well, we're catching some of the reflections of the distant headland, but also emphasizing the movement of the water, a little bit of a swell going on with some of those angles. I could have used the Princeton brush for this. The actual brush shape, I think, is quite important here. Couldn't have used a flat brush for this. It needs to have a little bit of a point to it, I think, and the size of the brush is quite important as well. I'm using this smaller number 4 here, but I could have used a little bit bigger. As long as if I went for a bigger brush, I'd need to make sure the point was very good on that brush, and just do a few little practice marks, maybe first of all, just to make sure. You've only got one stab at this, after all, being watercolor, as you know. You've got to get it right first time. Let's just make that a little bit darker, that area there, just a few little marks coming down from whatever's being reflected. Now with a bit of lighter paint, I'm going to soften up the water's edge and the distance there. It's too hard, and so I've just gone over that line with a little bit of, like a light wash, like a little bit of a glazing in a way, just to give that softer edge there. And where there's too many light marks on the distant headland, I can cover up some of those if I left too many lighter marks. I do need to be careful here with my hand that I'm not going to smudge any of those crisp waves that I've just been painting in. Now, a bit more detail to some of the houses, darker rooftops, little windows here and there. Not too much water, excuse me, not too much water. Going with a bit of a warmer pinkish tone with the alizarin crimson. There are so many different building types over this, just you go mad to looking at it all, and just bog you down into a really tight painting if you spent too much effort on all of the details in that distance. So just want the impression, not too many, I guess not too many hard edges, keeping it nice and soft, the transition from any light area to a darker area. Just define that little bit of a harbour's edge where it's catching the light there. A few lampposts or something, masts, maybe flagpoles. At some stage I've got to give the rower some oars. That's going to be quite an important element to this, trying to get the angle right of those oars. Keep them, I'm going to keep them, as you saw in my drawing, I'm going to keep them fairly horizontal. Just a few more little marks. It's one of those parts of the painting that's going to be extremely difficult to know when to finish. You can just, the more you look at the photo, the more little darker wave marks you can see, and I'm thinking to myself, I'll just include that little one. Another element to this, I haven't actually included other buoys, could put those in. I guess I've compensated with that by going with those darker wave reflections. I think they would be lost in here if I put in some distant buoys. Well, I'm really getting into the finer detail stage of the painting now, where if you've seen me paint before, and I guess many other watercolor painters are like this, when they get into that detail stage, they're using a smaller brush, thicker paint, just trying to pull the overall composition together, adding in finer touches to the painting. I've got to get the dreaded oars in. So start with his right hand one, or on the left hand side, his right hand one. Let's have that. So he's pulling this in a little bit more. His left arm is a bit further forward, so this oar on the right hand side is going to be maybe angling a little bit further back. I think that should look okay. I'm connecting a little bit to a wave, doesn't really matter. A few little bits and pieces on top of the boat just to make it a little bit more realistic. front of the boat, add a bit more definition to that. Not that there is one on the source photo. A few more marks in the background. With these distant houses, it's important not to have too many windows. When you look at the photo, you can't, yeah, there's actually lots of windows down by the shoreline, the buildings down there, but as you go, the houses further up the hill, they're less evident. They're just sort of, well, the houses are just basic shapes, really. With these wave marks, it's important to, with my tape down the side of the painting, I should have mentioned that, but I'm going over the edge. You can see it's quite a dirty edge there, so when I pull that tape off, I'm going to get a nice crisp white edge, nice sort of frame around it, but not a sort of jagged edge. So those waves, I continue over the edge of the paper. It's quite important, I think. Just a few more final thinner wave marks in the distance. A little bit more on that left-hand side where, with the direction of the sun, it's a little bit darker over there on that left-hand side. Now I'm going to apply a little bit of white paint. I use white gouache from Winsor & Newton, and just a few little sparkles with a smaller brush, top of the head. Particularly useful if behind the head it's a little bit darker. That would make it stand out a bit more. Shoulders, the top of that, or not too much water on the brush at this stage, but a good brush with a good point or a fine line. And with this white pen, I could, on the right-hand side of where the darker marks are, I could apply just a tiny bit of white paint that's attracting a bit of light to it. Particularly over there on the right-hand side, that's the lighter area. Just a bit of light on the right-hand side of that darker mark. Emphasizing some of the crests of some of those waves and just a little bit of the sort of lacy marks that you get with the white in a sea like this. Tiny bit of light hitting the sides of some poles in the distance, some flagpoles or street lights. There are just a few. It is in the distance, don't want to put too much detail in there. There's a few little marks at the water's edge. Not sure if it's posts in the water, maybe mooring points, something like that, possibly. Bit of light to the left hand, the the top of the left-hand arm of that figure. And now, thinking about the movement of this boat, the boat in my photo is stationary, so I've not got too much guidance. So I'm just basically guessing here that there might be a little bit of water catching a little bit of sparkle on the water's edge of the boat, just where it's disturbing the water surface, and then just maybe a little bit coming out from the boat, where giving the sense of movement. It's going from left to right, just a little bit of movement, but not too. Being a rower and struggling against these conditions, maybe not too much movement there to suggest the rowing action. And that's it. A quick self-critique then, as I normally do at the end of my full-length demo videos, just a review, summary of what we're trying to achieve, and this my particular take on a way of painting waves with watercolor using the acronym CLOVES, C-L-O-V-E-S. I couldn't think of anything more imaginative, so apologies for that. But C for color. Think about the color here, the warmth of the color, the cool colors. What color would you use from your palette? So I had a mixture of warms and cools here: cobalt blue, cerulean blue, quinacridone gold, the color there. The layers, I start off with that light blue layer and then introduced progressively slightly darker layers on top. O for observation. Before all of this, sorry, these letters are not in sequence, it's not too intelligent, but observation, just spending time. A little bit easy with a photograph, scenic photograph, where we can observe the shapes of these waves and try to think how we might plan our approach. Then values, darker blues, lighter blues, darker browns, slightly lighter reflection marks, and edges. So let's see if I've got quite a few hard edges. I could have actually had a few soft edges, but a hard edge there, the edge of that reflection against that lighter water, maybe in the distance, softer edges, the transition of that light blue to a bit of a warmer horizontal band, which I got with that glazing with the Wilmot brush, just getting a bit of softness there. Can I see any other softer edge? Oh yeah, softer edge with the dry brush marks. That's a softer edge, not too hard. The direction of those, maybe the brush marks could have been the other way. Thinking about the crest of the wave, let me just see one. Now these might be better. So I've got a hard edge there, top of that, crest that wave, but then dragging down the direction of the brush mark and getting a little bit lighter, a little bit softer down towards the trough of that wave, and then we've probably got another peak going up here. So observation and the values and those edges, and sorry, S for shape, the shape of these marks as well. You just think about what brush mark would you use to create those reflections, the darker reflections particularly that stand out a little bit more. There we are. Hope you like it. Catch up with you on the next video.